Maybe a related issue is some people claim actually that Flight 93 was in fact brought down by a missile.
And I think to us, when we started this project, that was probably the most plausible claim. I mean, after all, if that plane had gotten to Washington and they'd been able to locate it, and they would have shot it down if they could. But the fact is there were no military aircraft anywhere near it. And the terrorists did something that was very simple but kind of brilliant. They turned off the transponders in the planes. You know, most of us have this idea that air traffic control has these giant radars and they can track every plane at every minute. But in fact, most of the information about the planes in the air comes from the transponders in the planes that are transmitting their data and their location. If you turn that off, then they have to rely just on what they call the passive radar, which just gives back a vague blip, but with no information about what the aircraft is. So when they turned off those transponders, the air traffic controllers were completely stymied. They didn't know which way the aircraft were going. For a long time, they thought Flight 93 was still continuing west towards California, and they were trying to find it. They thought maybe it had crashed. It took a long time for them to get all that sorted out and begin to figure out where those planes were. Too long, sadly.
People claim that there might actually have been explosives in the World Trade Center to help bring them down. So a plane itself could not bring down the World Trade Center just hitting it.
Right. This is probably the most widespread. A lot of this comes from people studying these various films on the internet. And buildings come down, you can see puffs of smoke and dust coming out of some of the windows. People think those look like demolitions, squibs, or some kind of explosive. The fact is, if you think about the World Trade Center, the collapse of those Twin Towers has been the most intensively studied engineering failure in history. Thousands of pages of engineering reports, not all of them sponsored by the government. Hundreds of engineers from all over the country, major engineering schools, have looked at this. And what they've seen is that when you put 10,000 gallons of jet fuel in a building and scattered across multiple floors, the planes didn't hit straight on. Both planes were banked when they hit, so they intercepted 8 or 9 floors each and caused these very widespread fires. We had Vincent Dunn, the former deputy fire chief for the city of New York, in our office a couple days ago. We were to talk about this, and he explained to us that World Trade Center towers were not well equipped to deal with fire, and to have a fire raging simultaneously on multiple floors to that degree was really unprecedented. Furthermore, we think of a skyscraper as being a rigid steel frame structure with girders, but in fact, the World Trade Centers were revolutionary, very, very lightweight design center. I mean, you look at the Empire State Building, the building itself weighs 38 pounds per cubic foot of enclosed space. The World Trade Center weighs 8 pounds per foot. That's less than balsa wood. And when those fires raged through, they heated the steel. Conspiracy theorists will often claim jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel. But what the engineers will tell you is that it still doesn't have to melt to fail. You had thousands of tons of weight above the impact point on each floor. As those fires raged, they weakened the steel. They made the floors, which were suspended by these very lightweight steel trusses, begin to sag. Those pulled in the outer tubular beams that form the outer structure of the building. Many of those had already been severed by the planes themselves. The planes had also damaged the inner core of the building, and as the heat caused the whole thing to sag, the weight from above finally caused the structure to fail. Some engineers are impressed the building stood as long as they did.
Yeah, and in fact, the difference in construction, for example, there was a bomber that once hit the Empire State Building, but that caused very little damage.
Yes, exactly, and that was a B-25 bomber in 1945. And yes, it didn't do that much damage because that building was built like a bunker compared to the World Trade Center. And of course, the B-25 is a fraction of the size of the aircraft that hit the World Trade Center. But the other thing about the explosives, you know, we talked to the heads of all the major demolition companies, and they said, first of all, it would take months to wire a major building like that for demolition. Secondly, you wouldn't do it in the manner that you see those buildings come down. Those buildings, the collapses began at the point of impact. So to imagine this whole demolition thing, they would have wired the building that way and then make sure the planes crashed at exactly the right floor. And just trying to imagine how this would all happen, it gets pretty elaborate. Another thing you see the conspiracy theories cite a lot is the idea that there were seismographs at Columbia University picked up these sharp seismic spikes that proved that there were explosives in the building that went off to precipitate each collapse. You know, that's the kind of thing. What we saw our role is just digging into those kinds of core facts. So we went to Columbia, we looked at their report, freely available. We talked to the geologist who wrote the report about what the seismographs picked up that day. The report says nothing of the sort, and the geologists are outraged that their work has been so misrepresented. There's absolutely nothing in the seismographic signal whatsoever that indicates explosives, just the energy of huge buildings falling to the ground.
Given the weight of all this scientific evidence that supports the more conventional view, why do you believe these conspiracy theories persist?
Well, in many fields, people have the need to believe that there's some greater force at work. Some of it's politically driven. I think some of it's driven by natural curiosity. And people have a lot of anger about September 11th, justifiable anger, why our government didn't do a better job of being prepared, protecting us. So people move from saying they should have done a better job, they should have been more alert to the warnings, they should have been better prepared, to thinking that somehow somebody deliberately was involved in. And, people don't always trust the government, and they shouldn't necessarily always trust the government. I mean, people should be skeptical. They should ask questions. But if you're going to ask questions, you need to listen to the answers. And what we find troubling about some corners of the conspiracy movement is the tendency not to listen to the answers, but to continue repeating the incorrect facts and sort of burying anybody who disagrees with under accusations and attacks, as opposed to really wrestling with the mountain of evidence that does exist that could help us understand that day.
Opinion, do you think these myths or these conspiracy theories will persist, despite all of the evidence that...
Well, they seem to have really gained some traction. Our goal is just to help people get to the core facts. We're not touching politics. We're not touching these sort of grand global theories. We're focusing on concrete physical evidence. But what's so striking is how every time you trace one of these claims down to the actual physical claim, it turns out to be wildly incorrect. And the conspiracy movement seems to just, when something's challenged like that, just move on or just keep repeating it. And, the original story that Popular Mechanics did got a lot of attention in conspiracy circles, and yet many of the points which were debunked are just repeated endlessly today, usually accompanied by an accusation that somehow we're complicit, and so is Scientific American magazine, and so is The Nation, and so is anybody else who's ever had the audacity to actually take conspiracy theorists at their word. When they say somebody should check this out, we did check it out, and we did make a good faith effort to get to the facts. And the facts, in the end, at least on the ones that we looked at, simply aren't there. And we're open to investigating more if people think we missed something.
All right. Well, the new book is Debunking 9/11 Myths. And Mr. Miggs, again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure.
And you are listening to the Berkeley Groks Science Show. That was Mr. James Miggs, editor-in-chief of Popular Mechanics, debunking conspiracy theories surrounding 9/11. Well, coming up next, it's the world-famous question